And now, what better way to start this summit than a fireside chat between Public COO Hanna and the former UK Prime Minister, Tony Blair.
Thanks, Alex, and welcome to this opening session of the GovTech Summit 2020, where I am delighted to be joined by Tony Blair, who you will all know as the UK Prime Minister from 1997 to 2007, and who's now the chairman of the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, which supports countries around the world and develops policy with a particular focus on technology policy. Our theme today is crisis to recovery, and throughout the day we'll be looking at ways technology has been and can be used to help weather the storm that COVID has brought, but also to build a better future for public services. Tony's Institute has today released its latest paper on the ways in which government needs to evolve to harness the power of technology, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But first of all, welcome, Tony. It's wonderful to have you with us.
Thanks, Hannah.
I wonder if we can maybe start by taking a step back for a second. Tony, facing a crisis on this scale must be every Prime Minister's nightmare. It poses a huge challenge for government, both in the immediate term and in planning for the future. What do you make of this government's response?
Well, the first thing to say is it is the toughest challenge that I think government around the world has faced in living memory. So you've got to be fair about this. I mean, I was Prime Minister for 10 years. I know how difficult the job is. I know how difficult these challenges are. And this is of a different order challenge. I think that the response has been mixed, frankly. We were too slow to lock down at the beginning. Mainly what I've been pushing in recent times is the need for testing on a large scale. And I think the problems always in government around these things are logistics. It's not knowing what you could do, it's the implementation. So mixed is I think most people say is mixed, even in government.
Well, I think it's interesting you talk about logistics there, because when you think about technology and the COVID crisis, for better or worse, you naturally think of the Test and Trace app. We were first promised it back in April, it was delayed till May, then scrapped and rebuilt, and it's finally launched last Thursday and now has, I think, 12 million people signed up to it. But why do you think it's been so hard to get that Test and Trace app up and running? And what does that say for the readiness of our digital services in government?
Well, I just think we made an error at the beginning in thinking we could design our own app and it was going to be better than the apps that are designed by companies that do this for a living day in, day out on a global scale. So once we've got over that, then we've got the app up and running now. Look, 12 million is not bad. I mean, in Germany, I think around 22% of people download the app. Ireland, 37%, but it's a smaller population. It's a pretty good start. But I still think the most important thing is to be in a position where you can do testing at a scale that enables you to go through this period where you've got rising cases and where if you're not careful, you're left with a very unpalatable choice between allowing cases to rise and back down the economy. And I still think that's the only way you're going to get where we are now, the bridge to a vaccine testing.
You've talked a lot about the need for mass testing and also for a digital ID to enable health passporting. Do you think that's something that the public would embrace?
I think they would embrace digital ID, frankly, and I think a lot of the arguments against it are based on noise rather than a real proper assessment of public opinion. But on the testing side, the issue that government hasn't really resolved yet is whether it's right to use more than the PCR tests that are available now. Some further innovations that are coming on stream very shortly. And whether we go further than that and use some of the rapid tests that are available in the private sector, many people are using. And the government's argument up now has been that these are of insufficient accuracy. And I just believe that's a fallacious argument. I think that even if they're not the full accuracy of your your gold standard PCR tests, they're nonetheless extremely useful. And unless you can get testing at scale, I think it's very hard to contain a situation where people are back at school, they're back at work, they're using public transport again. So I think all of these things, need to be resolved now. And as I say, the testing, I think we set out, for example, how you would use testing for the education system, both in schools and universities. Go back to digital ID. The sensible thing would be, and especially so when you get vaccinated, to have the capability of people being able to show with their digital ID, had this test, taken the vaccine. Virtually all the vaccines that are being developed, not all of them, but most of them, are going to be a 2-dose vaccine. So you'll take a first dose and then you'll take a booster. It's going to be really important that we're able to track, who's had it, then make sure that they then have their second dose. You'll need to have a register of those that have been vaccinated. And I think even after you get the vaccine, testing will still be important. So I don't see how you can make international travel operate again unless you've got some form of digital knowledge of what your disease status is. So I just think, we've got the opportunity with technology to handle a lot of the issues around privacy, but digital ID across a whole range of services, you could rent your home more easily, do your mortgage more easily. All of these things they're just a sensible part of the modern world, and we should just do it. I mean, I think you could get cross-party consensus on it, actually.
I think it's a really important point, and particularly around public expectations when those sorts of tests are available but not being provided. People will expect to be able to start moving around, going back to work, getting back into the industries that they've been pushed out of because of COVID. And that speaks to a wider point, I think.
Yeah, no, sure. So, for example, if you've got the Premier League using a certain type of tests, if it's good enough for them, it's probably good enough for a lot of different situations. Now, it all depends what you're trying to measure. If you want to know for certain whether someone has the disease or not, so you're measuring whether they have COVID or not, then it's probably important to have the full gold standard test. But if you're trying to measure infectiousness, right, these more rapid tests will measure viral loads up to a significant degree, which will allow you to be pretty sure whether someone's infectious or not. And if you test regularly, so if you look at, for example, what's happening in some of the university campuses in the US now, they're taking their students back on campus, they're testing them twice a week. Now, will all of these tests be absolutely accurate? No, but because you're testing twice a week, you'll get the vast majority of people. And at the moment, you've got a situation where, when people worry about false positives, for example, you've got a situation where when you lock down, everyone who's locked down and doesn't have the disease is a false positive in a sense. And as for false negatives, at the moment, you're not testing people without symptoms. So since 70% of the people are COVID carriers are asymptomatic, of its very nature, you've got a whole range of people who are false negatives at the moment. So I just think this is where if you combine mass testing with technology, you're going to be able to live with this disease much more easily. Anyway, that's my belief.
I think there's a large cohort of new students who would completely agree with you on that one. But I want to go back to that point about citizen expectations, because throughout the course of the crisis, we've seen public services digitised at a much more rapid pace than we have done in previous years. By necessity, we've seen school classes going online, we've seen courts and tribunals using video services, GPs using video services. Do you think that coming out of this, for me at least, it's hard to imagine going back to how things were before? Do you think that's a general feeling? Do you think the public's expectation for digital services has been heightened by the COVID crisis?
Yes, I think so, both from what they get from government, but also for the private sector as well. I mean, if you think the shift to online purchasing and so on. But I think the most important thing you realize about government is that when there's an actual crisis, decision making is sharpened and it becomes much more effective. And the risk is then when you return to normal, you kind of leave that form of more effective decision making behind you. You go back to the old bureaucratic ways. The truth is, with this technology revolution, what this crisis has taught us is what the possibilities are for technology. I mean, if you just think about it, technology in terms of innovation around testing and vaccination, technology such as the one we're using now, as you rightly say, we've probably done more to shift to online consultations for the NHS in the last 6 months than we have in the last 6 or 16 years. Those schools that have used technology properly have managed to keep their students up to scratch. There's a whole series of things that have happened that show us what the capability of technology is. And we've got to take that now. I mean, hopefully, as eventually we get to more normal times, we've got to keep the same sense of urgency about how you use technology to transform the way government works. Because otherwise you have this bizarre situation where the whole of the rest of the world, in the private sector at least, and in civic society and in the way people live and work and interact with each other, all of that's undergoing a revolution, and government bureaucracy stays fixed in the same place.
Quite right, and I think one of the key takeaways for me from the crisis has been embracing more risk and trying things through technology to try to make things better. Something that government tends not to be very good at, but has been forced to do because of the situation we find ourselves in.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, but I think also to be fair to government, and in a way the attempt to develop our own app as an example of this. You're right when you say you've got to be prepared to try and fail sometimes. I don't think there's any problem with that. But government, the safest thing in government is always to take the most risk-averse option. And one of the things I think has been what I would say is the biggest disagreement I have with the way governments in general have approached this crisis, not just our own, is that you need a risk calculus that is consistently applied. And what I mean by that is we're not going to eradicate this disease. We're going to live with it. And I think part of the problem is that with lockdown, a lot of the public thought, okay, first of all, it was herd immunity. We scrapped that because of the consequences. And then we went for lockdown. And that was a policy of eradication. But it never really was a policy of eradication. It was a policy of suppression, in the hope that you could then prepare yourself as you eased to be able to deal with the consequences of easing better. But that's not the same as eradicating it. So if you accept you're going to live with it, you need a risk calculus that says, yeah, there are risks. Whatever you do, there are risks. But make it consistent. So we were talking about students and schools a moment or two ago. Another thing is, international travel. I don't think you need to quarantine for 14 days. If you're testing. Now, is there a risk? Yes. If you want to have zero risk, put a 14-day quarantine in. But if you want to pick up the vast bulk of cases, you could test people after they come back after 5 days. Probably it's good enough for the vast majority of people. Likewise, if you're a business and you're wanting people to come back into the workplace, you use testing capability and you test regularly, you'll probably pick up the vast bulk of people. Will you pick up everyone? No, but there's no point in telling people to go back to work, or I'm not quite sure what it is now, but I think certainly we were telling people to go back to work, and some people do have to work. And even if you say, well, the people have got to be out of the pub at 10 o'clock, you're still saying before then you want people to be enjoying hospitality. All of these things are risks. The moment you send children back to school, it's a risk. So if you look at the most risky areas, they are going to be probably around schools and around the workplace and possibly care homes. Okay, you manage that risk, and that's my point. And I think if we don't get a more sensible way of managing the risk and use technology to assist us to do so, we end up in a situation where you're going zero risk in some areas, and then you're putting rules in place that, if you're not careful, people, if they don't see that consistent risk calculus, then they lose faith in the system.
Yeah, I think you're right, but I also wonder how we build trust in the system. We've had a question along those lines coming in from the audience watching today. How do we build trust between government and the public? Through the COVID crisis, we've accepted changes through necessity to get ourselves out of the house and to get to see our GP and to speak to our teachers and have our children taught. But how do we, going forward, help to build that trust where in the past it hasn't always naturally come?
I think people will trust the government if they think they know what they're doing, right? And what is really important, that's why it's very important to have a strategy, not a series of ad hoc reactions, but a strategy in which you explain to people exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it. And you explain to people there is inevitably going to be a balance between what the government stipulates or demands or orders and people taking responsibility for themselves. And I think, you need to do that in a very consistent way. So I think one of the things that is most difficult at the moment is to explain to people in a way that doesn't frighten them unduly, but does educate them about what I think is the principal COVID problem now, which is less to do with mortality rates. I think we have got much better at treating people in the most severe cases, and those mortality rates have gone down significantly, and they have around the world. There are drugs we can use that reduce the severity in the most serious cases. The issue are these what are called the long haul COVID cases. The issue is people who get the disease, they don't die of it, but several weeks, even several months later, they've still got serious conditions. And we need to both have a far better idea of what the numbers are around that. And my institute's just working on a whole lot of information around that now, but we need to know better what that problem is and give people the best advice as to how you can make sure that you're going to avoid the situation of COVID whilst leading as normal a life as possible. And that's why all the other things that we're talking about, the testing and tracing and tracking and so on, are really important. But you need to give, if you want to build trust, you've got to give people a sense that you've laid out the full picture for them and you're in it as a partner with the government.
Well, that's maybe a good time to move on to looking at the future, because you've put out a paper with the Institute today that looks very firmly at the future and how to take advantage of technology and how to reorganise government in order to do so. Fundamentally, you talk about a shift from being quite system-centric to government being much more user-centric. Do you want to expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, so I think the single big, leave COVID aside, although it's got many of the same lessons in it, but the single biggest change that's going on in the world, in the real world, is the technology revolution. And it's going to change everything. It's going to change the workplace. It's going to change every part of industry, the service sector. It's going to change the way that we interact with each other. And it should change the way that government works. So this revolution is going to offer us enormous opportunities. So the most important issue in healthcare today, okay, you can have a debate about should you spend this much more or that much more. That's a very old debate. And I mean, I'm not saying it's not a valid debate, and I went through all those debates when I was Prime Minister, but the single most important thing in the healthcare system today is how do you use technology to deliver a better service, better healthcare, better prevention, and drive costs, that are savable out, reduce those costs so that the system itself becomes more sustainable. Likewise in education. Okay, through this crisis, we've been using remote learning, but there are a myriad of different ways that even if we return to normal, we should be using technology to personalize education, law and order, transport. In 15 years, you're going to be having electric driverless cars. So just think of the change that makes in terms of employment, in terms of the way we organize ourselves. You look at how you run and organize a city today if you're using technology intelligently. So my point is just very simple, is you've got this revolution that's happening, but the change makers and the policy makers aren't in the right debate together. This is why I wanted to do your conference today, and why my constant theme to politicians today is the only way you're going to revive optimism about the future is showing that you understand this revolution, can master it, and harness it. If you show that, then there's actually an optimistic future, because there's a whole lot of things we can do far better. But it will have big displacement effects. It is going to mean big changes, and you've got to have a government that is re-engineered to help people through that.
Absolutely. Do you think government's capable of that change? You talk in the paper about some fairly fundamental differences in the way that the state operates, splitting delivery from policymaking and making policymaking far more user-centric, building small teams to focus on individual issues rather than being siloed in those kind of departmental structures that have endured over time. But you also recognise some of the political challenges in achieving that. There's no incentives for any one prime minister to push through that change is difficult to achieve. So do you think government can make that change?
Yeah, I think government can make that change, but it needs to be sort of driven from the top. You need to identify exactly the types of changes you believe you can make. And we were talking about digital ID. That's something I think you can do, but you need to focus on it as a government. You need to build political support for it. But I also think you need a different skill set coming into government. And one of the things that's most difficult about government in an era of change is that it becomes about implementation and doing. And that is, that requires a certain expertise. That's why at the beginning, the other thing I said at the beginning of this COVID crisis is you're going to have to pull a whole lot of people in from the outside into government. I mean, some of these issues around COVID are logistics questions. Now, there are people who do this stuff for a living. They do it day in, day out. They're going to know more than a civil servant. It's no disrespect to the civil servant. They just will. I mean, I don't know how we could use Amazon in the current situation around delivery of mass tests, but we probably could if we thought about it, right? Maybe we are thinking about it, but you know what I mean? It's this type of, you need to identify the task, you need to pull in different skill set. And you need to get, I would like to see, and I think policy's gone in the wrong direction in this over many years. I'd like to see much greater switching between public and private sector. Now, we did this a certain amount when we were in government, but people will then get very worried that, okay, maybe someone's leaving the public sector, going to the private sector, going to make money out of what they used to know and all of that. Honestly, I think that's a real second order question. To get people who've got experience in the private sector and bring them into the public sector is important. And likewise, to have people go out from the public sector into the private sector and learn things that then when they come back into the public sector are going to be useful to them. This type of, developing these interchangeable and interoperable skills are really, really important, because this stuff it can be complicated, and you need really imaginative and creative people at the center of government.
Well, I mean, I also wonder whether, people talk about the new normal post-COVID, far more remote working, and that enables far more diversity of geography involved in the policymaking process, rather than having Whitehall departments kind of focused just in London. Could we de-London policymaking by bringing in voices from around the country?
Well, I think it's going to make a difference, certainly. And even if say 20% only of people, or even 10% of people change and work remotely, that will have cumulatively a major impact. I mean, I think the ability of people to work remotely and maybe come into the office every so often. I think it's fine. I mean, I think, like most organizations, my institute and we got almost 300 people employed. We found in terms of productivity, the working's been quite easy actually to do. So yes, I think it does give us that chance.
And how do we maintain proper accountability? Because some of the constructs of policymaking are designed to keep that accountability, whether it's working to a manifesto that you've published in advance and sticking to it, whether it's collective agreement, consultation and responses, cabinet committees. If we move to a more agile and risk-embracing system where we encourage people to try things and fail fast, how do we maintain proper accountability through that?
Well, I think all those systems of accountability, Hannah, that you mentioned will stay in place. But, moving to a situation where the user, the citizen, feels much more power in engaging with the government, whether it's in the benefit system or, migration, or, taxation and revenue issues. I mean, I just think that's a sense that people live their lives like that now. And one of the things that's been a problem politically is people think that when you talk about the citizen as a consumer or a user, think that you're kind of individualizing things that should be collective. And I would say to people, no, you're giving people power over the system, but within a systemic framework that is created by government. But within that framework, you should be allowing a whole lot of different people to come forward with different ways of engineering government services, for example. I mean, there's lots of things that government does, both at national and local government, that would be better done by, small groups of people or in companies, or developing apps that are, outside of government. Let it happen. I mean, obviously, you need to make sure those systems of accountability are there. But I think people often use this just as a way of kind of shutting out innovation.
I think it also requires a shift to think more about outcomes and to focus policy on outcomes far more than inputs and outputs as well, because there are many ways to achieve certain outcomes, but you've got to allow, as you say, allow that innovation. Just as we wrap up, you mentioned hope earlier. Are you hopeful for the future of technology in government? Do you think that we are on the right path?
No, I don't think the political class as a whole has really grasped this properly. And I think this question of how you understand and master and harness the technology revolution is also the answer to the waves of populism. I mean, populism is based on pessimism. If you don't have hope for the future, you look for someone to blame. And the left might blame business and the right blames immigrants or whatever it is. But really, this technology revolution, which is the real world thing that's happening, does offer us hope, provided we can weave it into a narrative about the future that makes sense to people. And what's interesting, and my institute did a paper on this last year actually, is if you look at the 19th century Industrial Revolution, it was going on for decades before the politicians caught up. I mean, in those days, in the early part of the 19th century, the Whigs and the Tories were still carrying on with old arguments, when this Industrial Revolution was, of course, changing everything. Now, eventually, politics caught up. And then, of course, politics itself changed. Then you had the Liberal Party, and then you had the Labour Party, and, you had all the reforms and changes and so on of the electoral system and the way government worked. You created a proper financial system, the exchequer, and all of that happened. But the point is, it took a long time for politics to catch up. So I'm only hopeful about the future of politics if we have a political class that understands that whatever all of these other issues are that we need to handle and that are big challenges, getting this thing right, how you make most of the opportunities of technology and mitigate its challenges and its problems, that is the central challenge of our time. And that's why we need a different type of political dialogue. And we need to recognize that this is about understanding and about applying, and that there is an area that's around values, because the values you bring to this, making sure the benefits of this revolution are properly and fairly and equally distributed. All of those things are really important, but they happen, and this political battle happens against the backdrop of that reality. And it's only if that happens that I'm hopeful about the future, and I think we've got a long way to go.
Great. Well, Tony, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I think that last theme of needing to capture the opportunity of the future is something we'll explore in a lot more detail in the other sessions today. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure.